It was a nice morning in Glendale. The sky was bright blue and clear. Outside the coffee shop, lots of people were on the sidewalk drinking their morning coffee. One man sitting quietly at a table outside was Michael Carter. Michael was blind, and he came to this coffee shop every single day. Next to him was his dog Zeus, a big German shepherd who always stayed close to protect him. Zeus wasn't just any regular guide dog. He used to be a police dog before he retired. Now Zeus spent all his time taking care of Michael. Michael really loved Zeus and felt close to him like family. Michael was sitting there quietly drinking his coffee when suddenly 3 loud motorcycles came roaring up to the cafe. The noise was so loud it got everyone's attention. 3 men got off their bikes. They were wearing leather jackets with cool patches on them. They looked pretty casual, but something about the way they looked around made everyone feel a little nervous. The leader of the group was a guy named Chuck. Chuck was loud and confident, laughing a lot and acting like he owned the place. He was talking big and trying to show off to his friends. Zeus, who was always paying attention to everything, heard the noise and his ears went up. He could tell something wasn't quite right. The 3 men started walking around between all the tables, looking at people as they walked by. Then Chuck noticed Zeus and Michael. He stopped and stared at the big German shepherd for a moment. "That's a really big dog you have there," Chuck said. His voice made Zeus look right at him. Chuck laughed at his own comment and leaned forward a little bit, like he was testing to see what the dog would do. Zeus didn't move at all, but the way he was standing said he was ready for trouble. Chuck wanted to show off, so he made big movements with his hands like he was just joking around. "Is he really as smart as he looks?" Chuck asked his friends. His friends laughed, but it sounded fake and uncomfortable. Everyone around them started feeling more nervous. Zeus still didn't move, but his eyes never looked away from Chuck. Michael couldn't see what was happening, but he could tell something was wrong. "Is everything okay?" Michael asked. His voice sounded calm, but you could tell he was a little worried because he noticed Zeus acting different. Nobody said anything at their table, but all around them people were talking. Zeus was a dog who had been trained for really tough situations. He had learned to stay calm until he really needed to do something. Chuck saw that he wasn't getting the reaction he wanted, so he backed up a little bit. But he was still laughing that loud laugh. Michael still didn't know what was going on, so he reached out to touch Zeus. "Are you okay, buddy?" he asked in a gentle voice. Zeus moved a little closer to Michael, but he kept watching Chuck. Chuck was starting to feel uncomfortable about what he was doing. The whole outdoor area of the cafe felt different now. While Michael finished drinking his coffee, Chuck and his friends got louder and louder with their laughing. But now their laughing sounded mean and like they were trying to start trouble. Zeus stayed still right next to Michael, but anyone who was really watching could see he was ready for anything. His muscles were tight and his eyes followed Chuck everywhere he went. It was like Zeus knew something bad might happen soon. He wasn't just a regular dog, he was like a bodyguard who would do anything to protect Michael. Chuck liked having everyone look at him, so he walked over to Michael's table. He didn't seem to notice that other people were watching and getting worried. "You have a really nice-looking dog here, don't you?" Chuck said. He was trying to sound playful, but there was something mean in his voice too. Michael smiled a little bit, trying to keep things friendly. "Thanks. Zeus is my best friend," Michael said. Chuck tilted his head like he was curious. "Zeus, huh? Like the Greek god. Let's see if he's as tough as his name." Before Michael could say anything back, Chuck quickly reached out to touch Zeus's nose. It might have looked like Chuck was just being friendly, but Zeus had been trained to spot danger. Zeus didn't attack Chuck, but he took a step back and made a low growling sound. Everyone around them felt the tension get thicker, and it got really quiet and uncomfortable. "Easy there, boy," Chuck said, putting his hands up like he was just joking. But his eyes looked like he wanted to fight. Michael still didn't understand what was happening, so he put his hand on Zeus's neck to try to calm him down. "Sorry if he scared you," Michael said, and he really meant it. Chuck just laughed, but you could tell his feelings were hurt because the dog didn't like him. He stepped back, but then his friends started making fun of him. "So Chuck, you're going to let a dog boss you around?" one of them said. That one sentence changed everything. Chuck wanted to look tough in front of his friends, so he looked back at Zeus with a mean smile. Chuck looked around and saw that lots of people were watching what was happening. Some people were even secretly recording with their phones. Maybe that made him think twice for a second, but Chuck wasn't the kind of person who would back down. "Relax, guys. It's just a dog," Chuck said like it was no big deal. But Zeus could tell the difference between someone playing around and someone who was dangerous. Even though Michael couldn't see what was happening, he started to feel like something was really wrong. "Zeus, what's wrong?" he whispered. Zeus just kept staring at Chuck, waiting to see what Chuck would do next. Chuck took a few steps back, but he wasn't giving up. His friends kept laughing and making fun of him, which made Chuck even more angry and embarrassed. Chuck stopped and stared at Zeus like he was daring the dog to do something. You could feel how tense everything was. Michael still couldn't see the mean looks or know how much trouble was coming, so he tried to make things better by saying something nice. He doesn't like it when people get too close too fast. Maybe that's what scared him. But Chuck ignored what Michael said. He looked at his friends, then at all the people watching like he wanted them to think he was cool for what he was about to do. Chuck smiled in a cold, mean way and took a step toward Zeus. He put his hand out again. Zeus was still sitting, but he growled low, a clear warning to anyone who knew what it meant. The sound was quiet, but it was powerful enough to make people around them look worried. But Chuck seemed like he really wanted to see how far he could push things. "Come on, big guy," Chuck said with a fake laugh. "Are you as tough as you look?" This time, before Zeus could do anything, Chuck lightly tapped the side of Michael's chair. That little tap made Zeus stand up in one quick, strong movement. That was the last straw for Zeus. Zeus didn't run at Chuck, but the way he was standing changed completely. Now he was totally alert and his body was tense like he was ready to fight. The people around them started talking to each other, and more people took out their phones to record what was happening. Michael felt Zeus change how he was acting, and his forehead wrinkled with worry. He put his hand on Zeus's neck, trying to calm him down, but now he knew something was definitely wrong. "What's going on here?" Michael asked out loud. He looked worried. Chuck just laughed, but now it was a nervous laugh. He knew he was playing with fire, but he couldn't back down in front of his friends and all the people watching. "Nothing really," Chuck said, waving his hand at Michael to tell him to relax. "We're just messing around." Right then, a woman who had been sitting nearby stood up. "Hey, you need to stop this," she said in a strong voice. "Leave the dog alone." Her voice was loud enough for everyone on the sidewalk to hear, and for the first time, Chuck hesitated. Chuck started feeling embarrassed and he looked around and saw all the people giving him dirty looks. Zeus didn't move, but he kept staring at Chuck, ready to do something if Chuck tried anything dangerous. The tension was still there, like a rope that was about to break. Chuck looked at the woman who told him to stop, but he didn't say anything. The crowd of people around them started getting more uncomfortable. They kept looking back and forth between Chuck, Zeus, and Michael, who looked even more confused now. Chuck felt everyone looking at him, so he took a step back. But he wasn't really giving up, he had something else planned. "Relax, we're just having fun," he said, trying to act like nothing was wrong so people would think he was still cool. But inside he felt like he needed to show everyone he was the boss. Zeus stayed perfectly still, watching every single thing Chuck did with perfect attention. It was like he was reading Chuck's mind and knew what Chuck was going to do next. Michael held Zeus's leash tighter and whispered, "Zeus, calm down. What's going on?" Michael couldn't see how Chuck was standing in a threatening way, but he could feel that something bad was in the air. Zeus wasn't a normal dog, he had been trained to protect people. Right then he was in full protection mode. Michael trusted Zeus completely, but all the tension was making him feel really nervous. Everyone around them seemed frozen, and the heavy silence made everything feel even more scary. All of a sudden, Chuck made a quick move. He pretended like he was going to back away, but then he did something impulsive. He kicked one of the chairs nearby, pushing it toward Zeus. The sound of the metal chair hitting the ground was really loud and echoed down the street. A few people gasped because they were surprised. Zeus reacted instantly. He stepped to the side and dodged the chair really gracefully. Then Zeus growled louder than before, and his protective stance became even more obvious. It was a clear warning that he wasn't going to put up with Chuck bothering them anymore. "Hey, stop!" the woman yelled again, and this time she sounded even more serious. A few other people started speaking up too, asking Chuck to stop what he was doing. But Chuck seemed trapped by his own big ego. "What's the problem? Haven't you ever seen someone play with a dog before?" he said, trying to act like he didn't care. But his hands were made into fists, and it was obvious he wasn't in control of what was happening anymore. Zeus stood firm, his eyes locked on Chuck. It was like Zeus was studying every movement Chuck made, ready to do something if he had to. Michael finally realized something really serious was happening. He slowly stood up, holding Zeus's leash tightly in his hand. "Can someone tell me what's going on here?" he asked loudly. Now everyone could tell he was worried. But before anyone could answer him, Chuck stepped forward. He leaned toward Michael like he was trying to scare him directly. Everyone held their breath, and Zeus understood that Chuck was threatening his owner. Zeus lowered his head a little bit, getting ready to defend Michael no matter what. The tension reached the highest point when Chuck took another step toward Michael. Chuck was so close now that even someone who couldn't see would feel threatened. "What's wrong, buddy? Are you hiding behind your dog?" Chuck said with a mean laugh that seemed to hide how uncomfortable he really felt. But Michael stayed calm even though his voice shook a little bit. "Zeus never hides me from anything," Michael replied, holding the dog's leash really tight. "He's here to protect me, and it seems like he knows something I don't." Zeus stayed still, but the growling sound in his throat got louder every second that passed. The crowd around them had been unsure before, but now they were starting to talk louder. They were clearly uncomfortable with how Chuck was acting. An older man sitting at a table nearby finally stood up and got involved. "Hey, this has gone too far. You should leave before something bad happens." But Chuck was driven by his pride and the pressure from his friends, so he ignored the old man's advice. Chuck looked at the old man like he was just another thing in his way, but you could see on Chuck's face that he was getting more and more uncomfortable. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a sound nobody expected. Zeus barked really loudly, a deep, strong bark that made Chuck automatically step back. It was a sound that couldn't be ignored, and everyone knew exactly what it meant. The dog was ready to do something. The crowd reacted with surprise. Some people were filming, others were backing away. The whole energy of the situation changed completely. Michael heard Zeus's bark and knew something really serious was about to happen. "Zeus, it's okay. I'm fine," he said, trying to calm down the German Shepherd. But Zeus kept his eyes locked on Chuck, like he was saying he didn't believe those words. Then, in one last try to save his reputation, Chuck impulsively stepped forward and reached out to push Michael by the shoulder. It was a quick move, but not fast enough for Zeus to miss it. Zeus reacted in the blink of an eye. He positioned himself between Chuck and Michael with a fast move that put him directly between the biker and his owner. Zeus didn't attack, but he stood firm with his teeth showing slightly. It was a clear warning that this needed to end right there and then. The whole street became completely silent. Chuck froze and couldn't move, while Zeus's stare seemed to go right through him. Michael knew that something very serious had just happened, so he lifted his head and said firmly, "I think it's best if you leave now." The crowd around them began to talk, and this time they were all against Chuck. Chuck looked around and realized he had lost control of the whole situation. Without saying another word, he slowly backed away, trying to hide how embarrassed he felt. His friends followed him without talking, and within seconds the whole group disappeared around the corner. The morning that had started with soft, normal sounds was now filled with people talking and tension everywhere. Michael felt the air around him change. Even without being able to see, he could sense that the energy was completely different. The sound of the motorcycles in the distance got quieter and quieter, and instead there was the muffled noise of people talking about what they had just seen. Zeus stayed right by his side, still alert. His body was still tense, but there was something more, a little shaking in his front paws. Michael felt the shaking through the leash, so he crouched down and touched the fur of the German Shepherd. "Zeus, it's okay now, buddy," he said quietly, trying to calm him down. But Zeus seemed unsure. His eyes were still looking at the spot where Chuck had disappeared. It was like Zeus knew that Chuck wasn't just a one-time threat, but a problem that might come back. Michael gently touched Zeus's nose and whispered, "You feel something I don't you?" These words, even though they were simple, were really important. They showed the complete trust Michael had in his loyal friend. The crowd around them started to leave slowly, but a few people stayed close because they were still curious. The woman who had confronted Chuck took a few steps toward Michael. She had a concerned look on her face. "Are you okay?" she asked. Her voice was still shaking from all the excitement. Michael nodded, but his wrinkled forehead showed he was worried inside. "I'm fine, but Zeus, he's never reacted like this before. He knows when something's wrong, and that worries me." The woman crouched down and looked at Zeus closely. "This dog, he's not ordinary, is he?" Michael sighed. You could see both pride and sadness on his face. "No, he was a police dog trained to protect and serve, and if he had to, sacrifice everything. But that was years ago. I thought he had left all that behind. Now he's my guide, my family." The woman looked into Zeus's eyes like she was trying to figure out something that only Zeus knew. "Maybe he never forgot who he is," she said, almost in a whisper. The older man who had stepped in earlier came closer. "Listen, son," he began. His voice was deep and full of wisdom. "Dogs like him have instincts that go way beyond what we can understand. He didn't react like that for no reason. You should trust him and maybe stay alert. That man Chuck, he didn't seem like the type to give up easily." The stranger's words really affected Michael, and he gently held Zeus's leash tighter. Zeus looked at him, and his eyes were saying something that words could never explain. The moment was interrupted by a distant sound, the rumbling of engines. They weren't any closer, but they hadn't completely gone away either. Michael took a deep breath and petted Zeus's head. "Maybe it's just my imagination," he thought. But the shaking in Zeus's body said something different. What Michael didn't know was that this incident was just the beginning of something much bigger. Something that would test not only Zeus's loyalty, but also Michael's strength to face things he never expected. The tension seemed to have finally gone away, but not for Zeus. Even though he was now lying next to Michael, he was still breathing faster than normal. His eyes were alert and watching every movement around them. Michael could sense that Zeus was restless, so he decided it was time to leave the cafe. He grabbed the leash and stood up slowly. He gave a nervous smile to the few people who were still nearby. "Thanks for sticking around. I think Zeus and I need some fresh air," he said before starting to walk down the sidewalk. The walk back home was something Michael and Zeus did every day, but that morning every step felt really important. The silence was only broken by the sound of Zeus's paws on the pavement and the soft jingling of the leash. Michael couldn't see the world around him, but Zeus's behavior told him more than any sight could. Zeus was tense, and the way he was standing showed he was on high alert. It was a quiet but constant reminder that something still wasn't right. When they got to Michael's small apartment, he unclipped the leash so Zeus could walk around freely in the space. "You're acting strange today, buddy," Michael said as he felt around the kitchen counter for Zeus's water bowl. Zeus moved slowly through the apartment, sniffing every corner like he was doing an inspection. Finally, he stopped by the door and sat quietly, but with his ears up, listening for any sounds from outside. Michael noticed this and his forehead wrinkled with worry. "What's going on, Zeus? You never do this." As Michael sat on the couch, trying to understand what had happened that morning, he started to remember the stories he'd heard about Zeus before he adopted him. Michael knew Zeus used to be a police dog, but he'd never learned all the details. Zeus had worked on tough cases where his ability to detect danger had saved lives. Now it seemed like those instincts were coming back. "Are you trying to tell me something, boy?" Michael asked, petting the dog's soft fur. Zeus only responded by wagging his tail slightly, but his eyes never left the door. Outside, the distant rumble of a motorcycle echoed again. It was almost too quiet to hear. Zeus raised his head and his whole body tensed up once more. Michael didn't hear the sound, but he felt Zeus's reaction. He placed a hand on Zeus's shoulder like he always did to comfort him. "Whatever it is, we're in this together," he said softly. Michael had no idea that this promise would be tested very soon in a way he could never have imagined. The evening came quietly, covering the small neighborhood like a calm blanket. Michael sat at his small dining table, carefully cutting an apple while Zeus rested by his side. The tension from earlier was still in the room, a heavy feeling that neither Michael nor Zeus could ignore. Michael's fingers touched Zeus's fur as he spoke almost to himself. "Maybe I'm just thinking too much about this, huh buddy?" he said quietly. Zeus's ears twitched, and his sharp eyes stayed focused on the front door like he was expecting something Michael couldn't see. Outside, the quiet was broken by the distant sound of engines. At first it was faint, but it got louder and more clear. Zeus immediately stood up, his body stiff as he stared at the door. Michael felt the change and froze. "What is it, Zeus?" he asked. His voice was steady, but you could hear he was concerned. The engine stopped suddenly, and then there was a heavy silence that pressed against the thin walls of the apartment. Michael reached for his phone, and his fingers were shaking slightly. "Stay calm," he whispered to himself, even though his heart was pounding in his chest. A few moments later, a knock echoed through the apartment. It was sharp and deliberate. Zeus let out a low growl and positioned himself between Michael and the door. Michael hesitated before standing up, holding Zeus's leash tightly. "Who is it?" he called out. His voice was firm but worried. There was no immediate answer, only the sound of faint talking outside. Michael's heart started beating faster. He could feel Zeus's tension through the leash, the dog's readiness to defend if he needed to. "I'm not opening the door until you say who you are," Michael said firmly. Finally, a voice responded. It was deep and sounded kind of familiar. "Relax, man. It's just me, Chuck." The words sent a chill down Michael's spine. Zeus barked sharply and his growl got deeper. Michael gripped the leash tighter and stepped back, creating more distance from the door. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice had suspicion in it. Chuck's tone changed, trying to sound casual, but you could still hear something threatening underneath. "Just wanted to talk, man. No hard feelings from earlier, right?" Michael didn't reply right away. His mind was racing, thinking about what he should do. Zeus sensed how serious the moment was and stayed ready and alert. The silence went on, and Michael could feel Chuck's presence just on the other side of the door. "You need to leave," Michael finally said. His voice was steady but firm. The talking outside got louder, and then there was the sound of footsteps walking away. But Zeus didn't relax and neither did Michael. Something about what just happened felt unfinished, like a storm that was building strength just beyond what they could see. The uneasy silence that came after Chuck left didn't last long. Michael walked around the living room, his fingers lightly touching the familiar shapes of the furniture as he tried to calm his thoughts. Zeus was restless though. He moved to the window, his large body tense as he sniffed the air and stared out into the night. "What is it, Zeus?" Michael asked, more to himself than to the dog. The uneasy feeling in his chest was getting stronger, a knowing certainty that Chuck wasn't finished with whatever game he was playing. Minutes later, the sound of footsteps broke the quiet. They were muffled and deliberate, going around the outside of the apartment building. Zeus let out a sharp bark, his body coiled like a spring ready to jump. Michael froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He reached for the phone on the counter, his fingers fumbling to dial 911. "Stay calm," he whispered to himself, even though every nerve in his body was screaming that something was wrong. Zeus moved to stand by the door, his growl low and steady, a warning that vibrated through the small apartment. Michael connected with the emergency dispatcher, his voice shaking as he explained what was happening. "There's someone outside my apartment," he said, gripping Zeus's leash tightly as the dog's growls got louder. "I think they want to cause trouble." The dispatcher promised him that officers were on their way, but the minutes felt like hours. Outside, the footsteps got closer and more deliberate. Then came the sound of something scraping against the window, a subtle, threatening noise that sent chills down Michael's spine. The scraping stopped suddenly, followed by a muffled curse from outside. Zeus barked again, this time louder. His body was pressed against the door like he was daring the intruder to come closer. Michael held Zeus's leash firmly and backed into the corner of the room, his mind racing. He felt helpless, depending on Zeus's instincts and hoping that help would arrive in time. "They're coming, Zeus," he said quietly. His voice was steady despite the fear running through him. "Just hold on." Finally, the faint sound of police sirens cut through the tense air. The footsteps outside stopped immediately, followed by the sound of someone running away. Zeus stayed on high alert, his growl getting softer but not disappearing completely. Michael let out a shaky breath, gripping the phone as he whispered into it, "They're here." "Thank you." Relief washed over him for a moment, but it was mixed with the realization that this wasn't over. Chuck had crossed a line, and Michael knew he needed to get ready for whatever came next. The flashing red and blue lights covered the street in a scary glow as two police officers walked up to Michael's apartment. Zeus was still alert, standing by the door with his ears up and body stiff. Michael opened the door carefully, feeling the rush of cool night air against his face. "Officers, thank you for coming," he said. His voice was steady despite the fear that was still in his chest. Zeus didn't relax. His sharp eyes looked toward the shadows outside like he could sense that danger was still hiding there. The officers asked Michael to tell them everything, taking notes as he described the earlier confrontation with Chuck and the scary sounds around his apartment. "He didn't do anything physical," Michael admitted, gripping Zeus's leash tightly. "But he's unpredictable and I know he'll come back." One officer kneeled down to pet Zeus, though the dog stayed on edge with his eyes focused on the area around them. "Your dog's instincts are sharp," the officer said. "If he's this worried, you're right to be cautious." As the officers looked around the area, they found fresh footprints near Michael's window. They followed the trail but found no sign of Chuck or his friends. "He's probably long gone," one of them said, though the way they said it didn't make Michael feel confident. They told Michael to stay inside, keep his phone close, and call if anything else happened. "We'll increase patrols in the area," the other officer promised him. "But if you feel unsafe, don't hesitate to leave for the night." Michael nodded, though he had no intention of running away. This was his home and he wasn't about to let Chuck take that away from him. After the officers left, the apartment felt heavier with silence. Michael sat on the edge of his bed with Zeus lying at his feet, still watchful. Michael reached down to pet the dog's back. The familiar motion helped ground him. "I don't know what's coming next, Zeus," he said quietly. "But I know you'll be ready." Zeus's ears moved at the sound of his voice, and for the first time that evening, his tail gave a small wag. It was a tiny moment of comfort in all the uncertainty. Michael finally fell asleep, though it was restless and troubled. Zeus, ever vigilant, stayed by the door. His body was like a protective barrier between Michael and the world outside. The bond between them had never felt stronger. It was forged in the fire of shared fear and trust. Whatever Chuck was planning, Michael knew one thing for certain: he wasn't facing it alone. Zeus was more than a guide dog or a former police dog. He was a guardian, a partner, and a reminder of the strength that comes from standing together.